Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're looking at an important development in the ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia. What happens when Russia finds its supply corridor to the peninsula of Crimea under serious pressure and the ways Moscow is scrambling to adapt. To understand this, we need to go back a little bit to how Russia's logistics have functioned in Crimea, why the corridor matters, what Ukraine is doing to disrupt it, and then how Russia is responding and what this might mean for the broader war. Let's begin with the background. The peninsula of Crimea was annexed by Russia in 2014, and since then it has served as a strategic bridgehead for the Russian military in southern Ukraine. After the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Russia pushed deeper into southern and eastern Ukraine, with Crimea as a rear area, supply, and staging zone for operations. Logistics routes connecting mainland Russia to Crimea are vital for Moscow to maintain its control of the peninsula and to support operations further south. A key part of that logistics network is the road and rail link between Russia and Crimea via the Kerch Strait, sometimes called the Kerch Bridge or Crimean Bridge. Russia built that link to bypass reliance on ferries and less reliable overland routes, but over time Ukraine has begun targeting those supply lines, bridges, rail routes, ports, and ferries. For example, after an explosion on the railway tracks of the Kerch Bridge linking Russia and Crimea, Russia scrambled to restore the connection. So when we talk about Russia scrambling after loss of the Crimea corridor, we're referring to multiple pressures: Ukraine attacking or threatening the vital supply routes, Russia having to divert, rebuild, or defend alternate routes, and the broader strategic consequence of Crimea's logistics becoming stressed. Let's unpack the pressure points. First, Ukraine's growing ability to strike logistics, infrastructure, and supply lines behind Russian occupied territory. We've seen attacks on Russian air bases in Crimea, e.g., the explosion at the Saki air base, that indicate Ukraine is reaching further. Ukraine has also struck the Crimean Bridge and other conduits, which forces Russia to expend resources to repair, defend, reroute, or engineer new supply lines. For example, the 2023 explosion on the Crimean Bridge. That incident is part of the broader context of Russia having to respond to disruptions in its Crimea supply network. Second, the geography and complexity of logistics to Crimea are non-trivial. The peninsula is connected to Russia via a narrow corridor, and supply often has to come over long distances through contested or threatened zones. When the corridor is disrupted, Russia must shift to alternative routes, which may be longer, more vulnerable, more costly, slower. In some cases, Russia has resorted to overwater or ferry links, or overland routes that may involve occupied territory in southern Ukraine, adding complexity. Third, the operational cost of supply disruption is heavy. If ammunition, fuel, food, reinforcement, or repair parts cannot reach Crimea timely, then the Russian forces there and the Ukrainian front further south are directly impacted. Morale, readiness, sustainment all degrade. Moreover, Russia's need to devote resources to shore up logistic infrastructure diverts combat resources, engineers, security, air defense assets. So now, to how Russia is responding to scramble. Based on open sources, Russia is taking several key actions. 1. Repairing damaged infrastructure, bridges, railways, supply depots often under pressure and under threat of further attack. The 2022 article from the Wall Street Journal noted Russia rushing to reconnect supply lines to Crimea after an explosion on the bridge. 2. Russia is seeking alternate routes. When one bridge link or rail route is compromised, they may divert supplies using alternate roads, oversea ferry routes, or through longer overland corridors. 3. Russia is defending these logistics arteries more heavily, installing barriers, increasing security and patrols, deploying air defense around supply hubs, reinforcing bridges. For instance, UK intelligence reported that Russia attempted to protect the Kerch Bridge by placing barges to reduce attack angles from Ukrainian unmanned surface vehicles US. 4. Russia is seeking to localize supply, increasing reliance on local production or salvage, reducing dependency on long supply chains. That's slower and less efficient, but in a contested war zone, necessity forces adaptation. 5. Russia is also adjusting operational tempo, potentially slowing or pausing offensive operations that rely on the threatened supply line, or shifting efforts to sectors less reliant on that corridor until the logistics situation stabilizes. The scramble has strategic implications. If Russia cannot reliably supply Crimea and its southern forces, then Ukraine's efforts to push in the south are strengthened. Crimea is less of a safe rear base and more of a vulnerable outpost. Ukraine then may exploit this vulnerability by pressing from the south, threatening Russian supply by land, sea, and air. Indeed, Ukrainian officials have claimed that Russian naval assets in the Black Sea near Crimea are no longer safe. For Russia, losing the corridor or experiencing repeated disruption raises the risk of isolation of forces, of losing momentum, of being forced into reactive posture rather than proactive. From a military logistics analysis standpoint, this situation highlights a key rule of war. Logistics wins campaigns. Holding territory is one thing, holding supply lines is another. Russia may hold Crimea, but if supply becomes precarious, then the hold is tenuous. The cost of maintaining a corridor through contested space is high. Security, engineering, alternative routing, redundancy, all expensive in money, manpower, and time. Ukraine's strategy of targeting the logistics rather than just the front line makes sense in that context. Let's consider some concrete scenarios. Suppose Russia's main rail link from Russia into Crimea is damaged. Repair takes days, weeks, maybe longer if under fire. In the interim, Russia must use overland roads, longer distance, fewer trains, smaller loads, higher fuel consumption, more vulnerability. Supplies may trickle rather than flow. That means front-line units may receive fewer supplies. Repair of equipment slows. Reinforcements come slower. Ukraine may notice the lag and exploit it. Meanwhile, Russia might divert via a ferry route, but ferries are slower, smaller capacity, weather dependent, and more vulnerable to Ukrainian attacks or drone/USV attacks. Another scenario, Ukraine uses drones/USV to attack supply ships or ferries heading to Crimea, or hits depots in Crimea to force Russia to haul supplies from even further. Russia then responds by increasing air defense, anti-surface barriers, escorting convoys, building alternate stockpiles in Crimea. That escalates cost and risk. Over time, the friction in supply may reduce the margin for error in Russian operations. If Russia must commit resources to defend the supply corridor, fewer resources are available for offense or for front-line flexibility. We also must consider the symbolic dimension. Crimea was meant to be Russia's secure base. If Russia cannot reliably supply it, the narrative of Crimea as inviolable begins to erode. That has internal morale implications within Russia and among Russian forces. It may embolden Ukraine and its backers to place even more pressure on Crimea and its supply lines. Now, it's important to note that Russia still retains various supply options and has not lost Crimea or fully lost its corridor. The scramble is about adaptation and mitigation rather than collapse. Russia will try to re-engineer its logistics, will build redundancy, may shift more supplies by sea, may increase local production, may use alternative overland paths through occupied southern Ukraine, but each of these options carries distinctive vulnerabilities. From a video review perspective, here are the key threads I'd emphasize: the importance of supply lines and logistics in warfare, and how a corridor like the Russia-Crimea link is a strategic lifeline, the pressure Ukraine is placing on that lifeline, attacks, strikes, infrastructure disruption, sea/air threats, targeting of transport nodes, the responses by Russia, repairs, alternate routes, increased defense, localizing supply chains, managing capacity constraints. The consequences: slower Russian operations, higher cost/risk for Russia, heightened Ukrainian opportunities, potential shift in momentum in the south. The broader war implications: if Russia's Crimea logistics become too fragile, then Ukraine may be able to exploit that weakness to push on multiple fronts. Conversely, Russia's adaptation may force Ukraine to increase its own effort or shift strategy. Let's walk through how such a scenario might evolve over the coming weeks or months. As Ukraine continues to target Russian logistics, Russia may pull more troops back to guard key nodes, bridges, rail hubs, ports. That may mean fewer troops available for offensive operations. Russia may build up local stockpiles in Crimea, but those stockpiles become new targets themselves. Ukraine may focus on deep strikes into Crimea or on cutting off ferry/sea links, forcing Russia to rely increasingly on overland routes, which may be slower and riskier. If Russia still manages to flow some supplies, but at reduced volume, the pace of Russian operations may slow. Front line units may lose flexibility. Command decisions may become more conservative. In response, Ukraine may accelerate its own operations, perhaps in the south, threatening to encircle or squeeze Russian forces from multiple directions. In turn, Russia may divert resources from one front to protect supplies, which gives Ukraine opportunities elsewhere. From the missile and drone dimension, Ukraine uses long-range missiles, drones, and USV unmanned surface vehicles to threaten sea links. Russia responds by deploying barge shields, anti-drone screens, escort vessels, and heavy air defense around bridge spans and ferry terminals. But these defensive measures cost money, manpower, and divert from front-line operations. Over time, the cost of maintaining the supply corridor may outweigh the benefit of holding certain forward positions unless Russia reorganizes its logistics into a more resilient architecture. Another important point: the morale and political dimension. For Russia's domestic narrative, Crimea is a strategic prize and a symbol of regained territory. If supplies to Crimea become visibly unreliable, trains delayed, ferry services suspended, bridges repeatedly hit, that narrative is damaged. That may affect Russian public perceptions, troop morale, and even the political willingness to commit further losses. For Ukraine, the ability to strike deep behind Russian lines into Crimea serves as a morale booster and a signal to Western backers that the war is not static. It's also worth thinking about how Western supplies to Ukraine play into this. If Ukraine is able to keep pressure on logistic lines, and if Western weaponry keeps enhancing Ukraine's ability to strike supply nodes, for example, long-range missiles, drones, ISR assets, then the effect on Russia's corridor becomes cumulative. Russia may have to invest in more redundancy, but redundancy in contested terrain is expensive and slower. Over time, a supply system under constant harassment begins to degrade not just physically but operationally. It may still function, but at reduced tempo and higher cost, there are risks and counters. Russia could shift more of its supply via sea routes, sub-sea cableized communication, or alternative overland paths through reoccupied territory in southern Ukraine. It may build bypass infrastructure roads, rails parallel to existing ones, increase engineering capacity to repair damage quickly, and step up security. It may stage supplies in Crimea more permanently so that frontline units are less dependent on long logistics chains. But each of these counters reduces flexibility and increases lag. If the front changes quickly, these stockpiles may become obsolete or get isolated. Additionally, the longer and more complex the supply chain, the more opportunity for disruption, intelligence breakthroughs, and targeting. For the video, when we look at Russia scrambles after loss of Crimea corridor, we should emphasize the word scramble. It's not necessarily the corridor is fully lost, but Russia is responding urgently and in a somewhat reactive posture. It's playing catch-up, fixing damage, rerouting supplies, reinforcing defense, all under pressure. That reactive stance is always worse than proactive supply management. In war, being reactive means you're losing the initiative. Initiative often rests in logistics as much as battlefield maneuver. In summary, the corridor linking Russia and Crimea is both a logistic lifeline and a vulnerability. Ukraine's efforts to sever or degrade it are strategic, hitting not just isolated nodes but the flow of everything behind the front. Russia's responses are technically impressive, but costly and slow. The more disruption that occurs, the more strain is placed on Russia's operational capacity in the south, and that may accelerate the war dynamics in Ukraine's favor. For viewers, the key takeaway is this. While Russia still holds Crimea, the fragility of its supply network underscores that holding ground is one thing, sustaining it under fire and in a contested environment is another. When the supply carpet starts tearing, the whole structure underpinning Russia's position becomes unstable. So that wraps up our walkthrough of how Russia is scrambling after pressures on its Crimea supply corridor. If you found this useful, hit like, subscribe for more deep dives into the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and leave your thoughts in the comments. What do you think is Russia's best option now? Will Ukraine manage to sever the corridor fully, or will Russia stabilize it and continue its operations? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.